Welcome back. The prevailing wisdom on Native Americans is now that they were primitive savages with inferior intellect. At least that's what we're taught that our founders and everybody else back then thought. That's not entirely true. Not everybody thought that way. George Washington loved the Indians. Thomas Jefferson had a very different view of Native Americans. In 1784, he dug out on his property a 12-foot high mound. It was something that he couldn't figure out. He found several complex layers of burials. He concluded that the mound was the work of Indian ancestors. Jefferson began to ponder this, and he believed that the Indians possibly came, in his words, from Egypt or Asia. He looked at some of the ancient writings. He compared them. He was fascinated with language. He compared Egyptian and Indian. He started to say, well, you know what? They're not as primitive as everybody thinks. Well, Jefferson, in many circles towards the late part of the 1700s, was attacked for his beliefs. He was called a howling atheist because of some of them. But John Adams was not one of them. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson did have a dispute on the American native, but it wasn't that they weren't savages. In their famous correspondence that happened in later years, they talked about the Native American and discussed James Adair's intriguing theory that the Indians were descendant from Jews because they had, according to Thomas Jefferson and Adair, the same laws, the same ceremonies, the same sacrifice, the same priest, prophets, and fast. Even the Indian dialect seemed derived from a common prototype of the Hebrew Bible. So they didn't brush off the Native American as wild animals. They were intrigued. Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark out. Part of it was he wanted to see the burial mounds, find out what those are. Now, in the beginning, Jefferson was an outspoken advocate for Indian sovereignty. In 1793, he wrote, "The Indians had the full, undivided, and independent sovereignty as long as they chose to keep it, and that just might be forever." 2 years later, he added, "It may be taken for a certainty that not a foot of land will be taken from the Indians without their consent." Unfortunately, later, when commerce and government started to collude, when America needed land, things changed. By early 1800s, Jefferson sought ways to get Indians off their land without force. His first idea was to let the Indians, see if this sounds like a familiar tactic, let the Indians get deeply in debt, and then when they couldn't pay, they'd have no choice but to concede the land. Does history repeat itself? These next examples go against everything Manifest Destiny teaches about Native Americans. We first learned about them from a documentary called The Lost Civilizations of North America, which explores why the artifacts and evidences of ancient civilizations have been lost and largely ignored. America's history didn't begin with Christopher Columbus came over. There were ancient cities with advanced architectures all across North America. Did you know that? Hundreds of years before Columbus came. We always think, oh, the Indians, they didn't scar the land. So, no, not true. These were cities as large as any in the world at the time. London or Rome, they were metropolises. Archaeologists say they have found evidence of 200,000 actual cities of mound-like structures all across North America that were here long before Columbus. But we don't know anything about them. Why? I want you to take a look at this. This is going to blow your mind. See this here? First, let me show you the Great Pyramid of Giza. You've seen this? One side of the Great Pyramid of Giza. If you measure it, it is from the bottom to the apex 606 feet. That's important. That's an ancient unit of measurement. It's referred to as the stade. Now I want to show you this. These are the Newark earthworks. They're here in Ohio. Yes, Ohio. The earthworks are made, they're structures that are made now of earth that has been built up from the ground in a perfect circle. Here it is, a perfect circle and a perfect octagon. But they were built by the ancient Hopewell civilization. They date back from 300 BC to 400 AD. So let's look at these structures here. Bring this up. I want to show you something. If you square the inside of the octagon, here's a square and here's a square. If you square it, this is what surveyors do when they're measuring. They square the circle, and then they divide that area into 4 equal parts, or cubes, and then you find that each cube is made up of 606 feet, 606 feet, 606 feet, 606 feet. 606. It's made up of stades, exactly the same. Now, if that's not interesting enough, look at the angle of the Great Pyramid of Giza. If you take the angle of the Great Pyramid of Giza, the slope is 51.8 degrees. Let's go back to the earthworks. If you measure the line that goes straight through the center of the structure, right here, and then you go true north, it's 51.8 degrees. That angle is exactly the same angle as the pyramids of Giza. It is the same math, the same calculations as ancient Egyptians. Let me show you one more connection. In 1860, David Wyrick, he's a guy who surveyed the Newark earthworks. He was digging into a mound near those earthworks, and he found a wooden coffin made of oak. They opened up the coffin and found a skeleton of a man holding a little box. It was about 8.10 inches in size. The box had been cemented shut here. This, by the way, is sitting in Ohio. Well, he opened up the box and he found a little man inside, a little black stone. They took it to scholars and they looked at it. The man seems to be carrying something, and there's writing here at first they couldn't recognize. The writing is, they thought in 1860, some sort of Hebrew. Well, finally, about 20 years later, they found some rabbis living in the area, and the rabbis looked at that, and they could read it. They said it was an old kind of block Hebrew, and it was a rendition of the 10 Commandments. Here's the thing we should be asking ourselves. I don't know the story of these. Do you know that? Did you know that? Do you live in Ohio, and did you know that? Why not? Were the American Indians wronged? Yes. Yes. And that's what we focus on in America, is we were bad to the American. Forget about it. It's in the past. The question should be the ones that the founders asked. Who are they? What knowledge do they have? Can you imagine the difference we would have now if we would put our differences aside and put our past in the past and concentrate on today? Native American history restored. We all know how slavery in America ended with the Civil War, but does anybody in America even know anymore how it all began? Next. We know how slavery ended in America, but how did it start? At first, slavery wasn't full-blown slavery. In fact, in the early colonial America, it wasn't slavery, it was indentured servitude. Now, what is indentured servitude? Well, indentured servitude is not the same as slavery. I mean, there's some important differences here. In fact, I think it shares many of the same things. Where are we over here? It shares many of the same things that we have in common with today's illegal immigration. I believe that illegal immigration is modern-day slavery. I've said that on the program before, but that's not quite right. Illegal immigration, the way it's happening now, is more like indentured servitude. For instance, if you're an illegal and you're working here in New York, you're barely getting paid enough to rent a bed, not a room, a bed, for 8 hours. Somebody else is going to rent that same bed for the next 8 hours. You have enough time to go sleep in it, and then you got to go back to being at the mercy of your employer. You don't have any real rights. The government's not going to help you. Nobody's going to help you because you don't exist. You're not in the records. In theory, indentured servitude is like that, but indentured servitude promised a light at the end of the tunnel, because after your contract with the master was up, you got what were called at the time freedom dues. That was usually a little bit of land and a gun. Most important part of freedom dues was freedom. Indentured servitude was a common practice throughout the globe at the time. The English, the Spanish, the Portuguese, everybody was using this indentured servitude. It was like slavery, but not quite. And it's not an American problem. It's a human problem that happened all over the world. Now, there were criteria on which people were used as early indentured servants. But here's what's not taught. If I said to you, was it a white man or a black man that was the master and the indentured servant, you would say it was like this. But the criteria at the beginning was not based on color. It was based on creed. It was non-Christians that were used as servants. Colonists didn't identify themselves as white. They identified themselves as Englishmen or Christians. Whites, blacks, you name it. They were all used for this earliest form of slavery. In fact, if an indentured servant broke a contract, they got the same punishment regardless of color. I mean, if this guy was the owner, this guy ran away, same thing as if this guy ran away. It was Christianity. That's how it was. And if you were Christian, you just said, I accept Jesus, you could get out. I honestly don't know why more people didn't say, I accept Jesus. You really didn't want to do it. Now, this is bad, but this isn't slavery. How did it happen? Nudge.